State Building Lessons from the British Empire. It's a good title for, especially to present at London School of Economics. I realize this is a paper that I'm really honored, not only speaking to an LSE, your LSE club, but also to that you're named after Amartya Sen. And I realize I need his comments on this if he's all willing. This is a paper that I think I have important reasons for writing. I wrote it for serious reasons. I want to talk about that, but it's about the It involves let me share my life. I'm holding up my copy of you can't see it if it's a small whatever. This is my copy of Lord Lugard's 1922 treatise on imperialist practices. The British Empire is a big deal. Lord Lugard thought he was doing it for good reasons and whatever. Yeah, the British Empire did. I think it did some good things. I know it did some evil things. People are entitled to feel passionately about it, and you're certainly if you feel angry about the history of the British Empire from any perspective, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. You've got reason for that. I'm looking at this because I want to understand the British Empire, especially when it got to Africa, and they'd run India now, and they'd run America, lost it, then they'd run India, and now they were pretty good at going anywhere in the world, taking over with minimal resources from the home country and establishing a stable political order. That says something fundamental about political order and how it's constructed. And I wanted to look at the nitty-gritty, the details of how they did it, what the doctrine was, and that's why I want to talk about this. And I'm not here to condemn the British Empire or to condone the evils that were effects of the vast enterprise that it was. And most importantly, I want to show you this initial screen that has the URL of the paper and also the where these slides are available in case you want to download them and look at them. And I think I will skip the personal. I just said the personal introduction, and here let's get to work because I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, and we've got an hour, so let me try to go through the main points as expeditiously as I can. The big question is when did state building become so difficult? Today, many people believe that even a global superpower with military supremacy cannot do anything useful to help establish stable government in foreign countries, no matter how much money it spends and how many soldiers and foreign assistance people it sends to those countries. But 19th century colonizers made state building look easy. As I say, the British Empire was able to, when it, once it got other European nations to agree that it was going to have the right to establish rule in a particular part of Africa in the 19th century, they just did it. What do we learn from how they did it? I think Rory Stewart, in his book, Can Intervention Work?, where his answer is almost no, but maybe. I think he's particularly sensitive to the point that the traditions of the British Empire are worth thinking about when trying to understand why the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan was so frustrating. In colonizing Africa, excuse me, in the late 19th century, Britain applied and refined techniques that had been developed in India. I don't know the full history of that, and I'd like to know more about that. But sources, as I say, I held up, and I'll hold up again, Lord Lugard's book, and this is a thick book, and I want you to know, it's also heavily annotated. I spent a lot of time with this old imperialist, and it's a manual on what the guy said at the end of his career on how to establish political order in a random part of the world. Marjorie Parham's 1937 critique of excuse me, of the British colonial practice that she observed in Nigeria. I'm going to quote at length, especially the last chapter, which I've put on web. The URL. The book is hard to find, but I put online a scan of the last chapter, which is where she gets down to criticizing what they're doing. Anthony Kirk Green's book on the symbol of authority, is the last of several great books that he wrote about the mechanisms of of British imperialism. As I say, it's at the high point when they'd really perfected the art of, for better or for worse, going into almost any part of the world and establishing rule if they had even weak military dominance. Mahmoud Mamdani's critique, Citizen and Subject, I was just looking, I'd love to hold that book up, and the moment I'm blanking on where in my bookshelf it is. Forget it, I won't hold the book up for you. It's also an important contemporary critique by an African of Citizen and Subject, and what I say will be influenced heavily by that, but I'm going to try to pull it together as a theorist. Let me say what the bottom line is, that what I think we've learned, that colonial state building, by which I mean setting up a colonial regime, is obviously not the same as trying to help Iraq to become a sovereign democratic state, which was what George W. Bush said was the American goal in intervening in Iraq in 2003. Those are different, setting up a colony and setting up and helping people to set up their own sovereign independent state. However, they are both about foreign resources trying to promote political order. And in that sense, there may be some things to be carried over, and that's why I'm doing this. And what I think is true about the British Empire, and equally applicable, if not even more applicable, in democratic assistance to helping a failed or fragile state to consolidate and become stronger, to govern accountably to its own people. The key is that management of a state building mission should rely on a decentralized team of plenipotentiary agents who monitor and respond to local politics. I like the word plenipotentiary. It has a lot of meanings, but it means having all the power, having a lot of different powers. And that's absolutely a characteristic of the standard approach of the British Empire in its state building, and it, I believe, was not successfully applied for instance, in American-sponsored interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. But democratic state builders should encourage local politics to be inclusive, not despotic, and if I fault the British imperialists like Lord Lugard for something, it's going to be that they chose the wrong form of local governance to encourage. So the most important thing I want to tell you about the British Empire is that my understanding of the practice is, and Anthony Kirk Green's book about symbol of authority, it's subtitled The British District Officer in Africa. This is the book I was looking for years, and I'm referring you to it. Kirk Green's book, let me highlight that for a moment. Kirk Green's book, actually this particular book is based on memoirs that many district officers wrote to let you know about what their lives were like. The British district officers were the essential backbone of British colonial rule. They had many different names in different countries at different times. Kirk Green suggests district officer or political officer. District officer is maybe the best generic term. The district officer's job was to oversee political and legal affairs in a district where he was the local plenipotentiary representative of the colonial government. He had lots and lots of powers that were delegated to him by the British Empire. In some ways, he basically represented everything about the British Empire in his district. If you do statistics, you find typically average districts had about 50,000 inhabitants. 20 district officers per million inhabitants was a common colonial practice. But it was essential. The African dogma for district officers was they should be able to tour their district, and the roads were bad in rural Africa in those days, and so they were touring on foot. And the district officer needed to be able to tour it in about 1 or 2 months out of the year. Most of the year, he'd be sitting in headquarters with an army of clerks and messengers who were indigenous local people. But the touring was essential. If there were problems in his district, if there was violence or unrest in his district, the first question his supervisors were going to ask would be, why didn't you know this was happening? And whatever the people are complaining about, why didn't you learn about it in touring? Were you really getting out of the headquarters enough and talking to people? The district officers were recruited from the army or from college. They got short courses on colonial accounts, tropical economic products, criminal law, Islamic law, hygiene and sanitation, surveying, ethnology, and languages. By the way, when you want to say there's something fundamentally wrong about colonial imperialism, and in brief, the first wrong thing is that a young British man, they were male, a young man in England had the option to after college to go be in charge of the political destinies of 50,000 people in Nigeria, and there was no equivalent opportunity for a young man in Nigeria to become responsible for 50,000 people in England. That's wrong. There's no justification for that. But and young women should have had the opportunity too. Their first job was as an assistant district officer for a year and a half, touring, and their first touring mission was going to be an immersion course in the local language. Promotion depended on exams in law, regulations, languages, but I'll give you two quotes. One from a district officer that Kirk Green quotes from his memoir, and the other quote from Lord Lugard himself. District officers really needed, in one district officer's words, an unlimited patience, a real sympathy for the people among whom he would work. And Lord Lugard says he needs initiative, but he also needs an almost passionate concept of fair play, protection of the weak. By the way, it's particularly English to me that Lugard talks about wanting to think about people's experience as a prefect in their boarding school was considered to be an important colonial. What you did in college was okay, but what you did in boarding school, that was something they wanted to know about in the interview. Look, here's the old imperialist himself. On page 113 of his manual. So here, good news. I've read this thick book, and if I threw it at you, it would hurt. It's a thick book, but on page 113, I'm happy to report, Lugard says basically 3 words summarize everything about colonial state building. And there's the quote, and it's 3 words: decentralization, cooperation, and continuity. All I have to do is tell you what they mean, and you'll understand basically his theory of colonial state building. I should say, Lord Lugard, 1858 to 1945, he was one of the primary people in establishing the British colonial regimes, first in Malawi, then in Nigeria, then in Uganda, and finally in Nigeria, whose name was supposedly suggested by his wife. His wife, by the way, was a professional journalist, and I think she inspired him in retirement to write the tome that I'm reporting on today. So I have to explain decentralization, which I'll now spell the American way, continuity, and cooperation. Lugard's principle of decentralization referred to the delegation of local authority to the district officers. Each district officer had full local authority to represent the British Empire and to exercise its power in his district. Under Lord Lugard's theory of indirect rule, which was the traditional forms of local authority were supposed to be maintained, but all their decisions would be subject to review by the local district officer. Foreigners in the district were also subject to supervision by the district officer. So what I want you to understand is British imperial power was geographically decentralized. These district officers, there's one for every 50,000 people. But within each district, the power is extremely concentrated in the hands of one officer. Later on, there would be several district officers and assistant district officers working together, but there'd be one small team and one head district officer who really represents all the power of the British Empire for the first approximation within his district. And these district officers, their primary concern is local political development. continuity. The district officers, Lugard's principle of continuity is about enabling district officers to make long-term commitments. The British Empire was not making these district officers into local lords of places. In order to prevent them from basically becoming the boss of the district and having independent authority, they're rotated. They have a lot of power, but 18 months to 2 years, that's it. Then they move to another district. That helps to solve a moral hazard problem, by the way. It's very important. This person has an enormous amount of delegated power. People with power can do bad things. And the organization needs to monitor them. I'm going to talk about the monitoring, but just moving them is a way of monitoring, because if he's abusing his power and taking advantage of people in ugly, nasty ways, or enriching himself, when he was moved out and the next district officer comes in, people who are angry are going to talk about what went wrong. So the fact that you're going to move within 2 years, and that one of your colleagues is going to be talking to the same people that you're working with in the system, that's a deterrent. That's one of the ways that the organization solved its moral hazard. But of course, that creates another problem, because power comes from, and political influence comes from long-term promises, and district officers have to be able to make long-term promises. And the solution is that, first of all, every district officer is supervised by the next level up, and it's a very flat pyramid at this level. There are typically 3 or 4 districts in a province, and the provincial commissioner or resident, is an experienced, older, former district officer. He's been a career district officer in this part of the world, and he's going to stay for a long time. He's not moving around so quickly. It's expected he might spend the rest of his career, or at least many years, in this province. So the the supervisor at the provincial level is responsible for maintaining continuity. The district officer can do anything he wants, but he has to put it in writing and share a copy with his provincial supervisor. And essentially, the supervisor, if it was something the British Empire wasn't ready to support, could intervene. So they're relatively closely supervised. The provincial commissioner has relatively few people under him, small span of control. The district officers are reporting to the supervising provincial commissioner about all political deals, selection of local leaders, local fiscal accounts, and so on. Then the provincial commissioners are writing, everybody's writing a lot, are reporting summaries of the district officers' decisions to the provincial governor, and the provincial governor's job is to write policy memoranda that codify the principles that are coming from the district officers' decisions. I forgot to emphasize one point, I think. Let me go back. Where did I miss that? Just a minute. Oh, I know it's on this slide in continuity. The district officers are regularly, sometime in their first decade, they're going to spend 2 years in the provincial capital, working in the governor's secretariat. So the governor is surrounded by a bunch of young district officers. He's communicating with old district officers, with the provincial supervisors. And every district officer pretty soon, early in his career, gets to know not only what it's like in the countryside where he works, but also how things work in the central secretariat of the colonial capital. And ultimately, the governor was sometimes a professional, an important person in the British government for other reasons. But if he was not a career district officer, then Lord Lugard tells us it's important to have a lieutenant governor who is somebody who's an experienced district officer and former provincial commissioner who's risen up to become lieutenant governor of the province. So basically, the team of district officers is running the colony. When they can balance the budget, London has very little influence. There's the nice colonial Africa building down the street from the London School of Economics. They were doing something. The most important thing they were doing was sending district officers young district officers, recruiting and sending them out, and helping to balance the budget when there was a problem. And then they didn't. Lugard's third principle, cooperation, it directs the district officers to build an inclusive coalition for local governance by developing trust and common interests with all major groups in the district. That's the third pillar of Lord Lugard's doctrine. Indigenous local leaders had to be assured of some benefits of power. That's how they were co-opted by the British Empire. The British Empire, obviously some people might think, no, we don't want Britain to come and rule our place, and there might be some resistance, yeah. But the British Empire would try to identify who's in charge and say, we'll work with you. You'll get some share of power in the system. Some people couldn't be co-opted, and then the British military power was important. But otherwise, they were pretty good at co-opting a large fragment of local leadership. That was the whole point. In Lugard's view, the primary goal of political development was to establish leadership at the local level that could collect taxes and manage budgets. Chiefs and headmen, those are the typical English language terms that are used for these local authorities, local customary authorities in this discussion. They would assess taxes. Then the district officer would hear complaints about the taxes, and then the revenue was shared between the local customary authority, as the chiefs and the headmen, and the mechanism of the British Empire. The British Empire was also collecting revenue from tariffs, from taxes on imports and exports. But in Lugard's view, the sharing of the tax revenue cemented the alliance between the local chiefs and the colonial officials. The payment of taxes confirmed the community's acceptance of their authority. But I want to say, when I got to criticize, when you look at what's kind of a little problematic here, the district officers get to play the good cop to the chief's bad cop. The indigenous chief, whose skin color looks just like the skin color of the people in this part of the world, perhaps, for sure, they say how much each person owes in taxes. If you think that you've been overcharged, it's the district officer whose skin color is much lighter. He's foreigner. He's not native from this part of the world, but he's the good cop. Mamdani's critique of British imperial practice is focused on the general tendency of the British Empire to promote local despotisms in Mamdani's terminology. To me, the term customary, I have to tell you, the term customary, it took me a while to realize this. I try to use the word traditional and customary could mean the same thing, but in the context of the British Empire, customary to me is a technical term that was used by the British Empire and is not necessarily in a way that we should suspect of sometimes being dishonest. Africa is a big place. The British ruled, what, 30% of Africa, something like that, 30, 40% somewhere. There are many different kinds of government, of social institutions, political institutions that regulated people's lives before it became pink on the British imperial maps of the day. Obviously, some things change. The British had a doctrine that they are respecting customary authority. But a general practice in most parts of Africa, more often than not, and certainly true of Lord Lugard, most notoriously when he's trying to pacify eastern Nigeria, the Igbo part of Nigeria. He felt that he would tend to assume that customary authority, traditional authority, was despotic. Certainly, most parts of Africa had some, probably, I believe that in many or most parts of Africa, traditional authority often had many forms of checks and balances. But chiefs were not typically elected by anything that looks like modern elections, but that doesn't mean that they didn't have to get a lot of popular support before they attained that position. There was often a traditional doctrine that the chief was all powerful, but the reality didn't necessarily reflect that doctrine. It was very convenient for the British Empire to pretend that these were that autocracy was the local tradition, and I do want to accuse when I see the faults of the British Empire on its legacy, I want to say I think that it's this tendency that Mamdani identifies for the colonial officials to interpret traditions in different parts of Africa as if they were traditions of autocratic despotism by local chiefs who basically would have all power over their people. I want to argue that colonial state building did not require local despotism, and Abhijit Banerjee and Lakshmi Iyer's magnificent paper from 2005 on different parts of India specifically identifies that only in about a quarter of India the British were in the business of governing through traditional rajas, traditional kings who were not displaced. In another quarter of India, the British took over direct rule, but then created local lords called zamindars. In about a half of India, they did not govern that way. They used local councils, or taxes were collected directly from individuals individuals had the direct right to appeal to British colonial authorities for redress. Colonial state building did not require local despotism, which could seem convenient when you were trying to set up a long-term foreign domination, but was very harmful to subsequent development. And Banerjee and Iyer show 50 years, their data is from 50 years after independence, and they still find that areas where the British governed through local feudal lords that they set up, that wheat yields are lower and infant mortality is higher than in comparable parts of India that didn't have this experience under colonial rule. It made a difference. Marjorie Parham, in her 1937 critique, notes that the ideals of indirect rule were best expressed by a Basuto chief, that's in Lesotho, who in the late 19th century urged, yes, that Victoria's imperial laws could apply in his country, but only after they'd been submitted to and approved by the council of his people, not himself, but his council. That's his interpretation of the traditional system he had, and that would have been much truer to indirect rule, says Marjorie Parham. The point I want to make is that Lugard's principle of cooperation sounds good because I think it is good, inclusive coalition, and he violated it himself when he would say, no, we're going to try to identify a local lord. I better go, move on. A.E.F. Figbo reports that in the eastern region of Nigeria, the Igbo traditions had no tradition of anything that was an autocratic chief. That things were by councils, and district officers worked with these councils as they were establishing control. That's what they did. But Lord Lugard himself, sorry, I'm quoting him, but he was so bent on the idea that he had to have a chief that he thought the solution would be to find a really important person from each community in eastern Nigeria, take them away, take their kids away, take their eldest son away, get him educated in Britain, teach him about autocracy. Well, Britain itself has a parliament, but teach them the theory of aristocratic privilege, and then send them back to Nigeria to make them the rulers of their Igbo people. So, I don't want to whitewash Lord Lugard, but I do want to say I think his principle, he was violating his own principle there, and it wasn't necessary. So Marjorie Parham argues this. She says, look, the alleged goal of our colonization is to build local self-government based on traditional institutions. We need to give the local leaders more autonomous responsibility, she says, but they also need to be given more public accountability. It was very convenient for the district officer to be if you're a district officer, you're from a foreign country and you suddenly are put among these people. Are they going to welcome you? It's very convenient that their local chief is alleged to have total power over you, but the local chief is accountable only to you. So if the local people have any problem with their chief abusing his power, you're their solution. So they're actually pretty happy to see you, foreigner that you are. That's very convenient. That's the good cop, bad cop trick. And it's it's a trick. And she sees it as that. Look, her third suggestion is then these local authorities, given more responsibility, given more public accountability to their own people, not through the district officer, but direct accountability to their own people, they should then be encouraged to federate, to create Nigeria, which is what she's talking about in 1937, through institutions that are weak national institutions that involve cooperation among the regional governments. They say that because I want to leave time for discussion, so let me move along faster. I've got this quote from Marjorie Parham. Let me read it. It's kind of remarkable. She says we should be encouraged. Marjorie Parham's critique is focusing on development of the new nations of Africa from traditional institutions of local government that should be locally accountable with only weak federal institutions. I want to say to you, I'm talking to you from Chicago in America. This kind of looks like how America got started in 1776. It's not a bad suggestion. She then says, of course, educated Africans who are ready to work in agencies of government should take more responsibility. They should be running the agencies of the government. But then she says something remarkable. There's one branch of our colonial government into which Africans should not be entering, and that's the administrative service, by which she means the Corps of District Officers. The district officers should aim at becoming increasingly advisory in their functions. They should be regarded as a temporary scaffolding around the growing structure of native self-government. African energies should be incorporated into the structure. To build them into the scaffolding would be to create a vested interest, which would make its demolition at the appropriate time very difficult. In India today, for example, the Indian Administrative Service, the IAS, in many ways looks like a continuation of the colonial district officers. And African countries also maintain their district officers. They did not do what she recommended. The point is, the district officers formed an excellent, I would say, a perfectly designed mechanism for influencing local political development in a country. But there's a fine line between supporting local political development and controlling it. African governments chose control, and indigenous district officers continue to exist and to this day in many or most of the former colonies, and they centralize. They create a mechanism for central control of local politics. I want to I want to suggest that after World War II, there was a fundamental shift in the way people thought about international development assistance. Lord Lugard is an imperialist, and you can criticize him, and I have tried to, and you can criticize him more. I accept that. I agree with you, but he was thinking that one of the points of the project is to help these people to develop an economy and a political system that can join the rest of us in the modern world as eventually as independent partners. That was his goal. He just had a long timeline for it, or at least that's the goal he alleged. And how did he approach it? He approached it through, it says at the bottom, through a decentralized team of local plenipotentiary agents who are focusing on fostering local political development. After World War II, the focus in colonial Africa is on developing agencies for a new sovereign national government. So the focus is on national. Look, the most important thing I want to say about political science is that strong states depend on a balanced relationship between local and national politics. That's true about the history of the United States. That's true about the history of England. Devolving a share of power to local government ensures that every part of the nation has local leaders with a stake in the national political system, and that makes the state actually stronger. It also provides better public service when some part of the local public goods are supervised by people who are locally politically accountable. But national leaders may prefer a weak state where all power is concentrated in their hands over a strong state in which they must negotiate with autonomous and politically independent local elites. Since World War II, development assistance has generally worked with and through a recognized national government, implicitly supporting a centralization of power. The old form of developmental intervention by a team of local plenipotentiary agents who focused on political development has been largely forgotten. I should add, I recently read an article by, I'm forgetting his name, Honig, his first name, who says that there's a fundamental difference between the USAID and DFID, and that DFID approaches local politics, giving DFID agents more autonomous ability to get involved in the whole picture of what's going on and to create their own strategy. In some ways, that is, of course, a continuation in Britain of the old colonial traditions. Since I really want to leave time for questions, let me say that this slide in brief is simply comparing the British invasion of Iraq, which was a state building mission, World War I from 1916 to 1922. And Gertrude Bell wrote at length about this, and she reports that there were basically the whole British intervention in Iraq in 1920 was relying on a core of about 70 local political officers or district officers who had experience serving as district officers in the British Empire. And they, although they came with an invading army, they formed an administrative network that could monitor and respond to local political forces throughout the country. They were overseen by a central administration with just 5 senior British officers, according to Gertrude Bell in her 1920 book. Whereas the United States led invasion in 2003 of the same country, heavily invested in the green zone in Iraq and in Baghdad in the center. And it took them 6 months to get a network of political coordinators at the provincial level and to begin soliciting political reports from these 18 governorate coordinators. And that's the period in which insurgency took root and got out of hand. It should have been basic doctrine that a network of district officers should have been ready to go to work as soon as the troops arrived in 2003, and the mission's overall political direction should have been ready to be all the major decisions like de-Baathification and the question of dissolution of the army. Those should have been run by the district officers who should have been ready for such consultation 2 weeks after the invasion. When the mission is to build a sovereign democratic state, it is even more important for the mission's management to demonstrate responsiveness to local political forces that was characteristic of colonial state building, but not of recent American-led democratic state building. So let me close and say, look, a nation based on mutual respect among sovereign independent countries is better than a global order based on colonial domination. We live in a better world. We still need some mechanism for repairing failed states when crime, violence and refugees and international terrorism can spread beyond their borders. To me, the key lessons from the history of colonial district officers that I'm trying to draw is that when the goal of foreign assistance is to support political development, which it isn't always, then all foreign assistance in each locality should be under the direction of a district development officer whose duty is to monitor local politics and encourage cooperation of local leaders. And you can reinterpret Lugard's 3 principles for state building missions today. Decentralization means giving one officer full power over foreign aid in a district when the goal is political, not economic assistance. Cooperation stipulates that this power is to be used to foster a broad coalition of local leaders. And continuity stipulates that the long-term direction of the state building mission should be substantially guided by its district officers through their provincial supervisors. And let me just say the democratic state building missions need a strategy for exit. And after a limited period, the goal of the supporting development must be replaced by respect for national political independence. And to just say what I mean by exit, in the transition, the portion of foreign assistance that's directed by the team of district officers should be reduced gradually from my ideal of 100%. All assistance is controlled by one person who's trying to get an inclusive political system established in this region, from 100% down to 0. And then independent aid organizations during the transition should be encouraged to fill in where the needs are identified by the national and local authorities. My last question is for you in London. Who could take responsibility for maintaining a reserve corps of district development officers who are trained in local government administration and languages so that the world can be prepared for the next state building emergency? The answer I want to suggest, it's at the end of the paper, when I talk to the Sen Club at London School of Economics, is wouldn't this be a good role for the Commonwealth of Nations, headquartered down the street from you, whose members certainly have the greatest understanding of what the district officers were about and what the system was about. And I've got the URL for these slides is at the bottom of the page here. So let me surrender the floor and hope for questions and discussion.
I was like, thank you very much, because I think I've got a few messages in the chat saying, how did you get this speaker? He's been so good and everything. So I think a lot of people are glad to be able to hear directly from the source. And I can see Celine has a question. So in case, Celine, if you want to unmute, or I can ask it for you.
No, I'm more than happy to talk. I have 2 questions. Thank you so much for the talk, firstly. Do you think that it's possible that decentralization could have aggravated ethnic segregation or ethnic issues by emphasizing local groups in politics over national identity, thereby working against state building?
Absolutely. First of all, one of the problems is separatism. Separatism might not be a problem. Maybe the country should. When I think about separatism, I want to talk first about Scotland. There are lots of people in Scotland who would like Scotland to not be part of the country you're in, Great Britain. There are lots of people in Scotland who want to be part of Great Britain. It's something that Scots disagree about, and how many millions of each sort are there is a question that I'm not qualified to comment on. But I do